But a more immediate problem faced the government on immigration. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta's drive to Africanise his country created a crisis for British subjects living there.
Towards the end of 1967, the heat was turned on the Asian community. Many Asians had retained British citizenship under the terms of the independence agreement. Kenyatta made them choose between becoming Kenya citizens or risk losing their jobs and trades.
When many Asians chose to come to Britain, certain politicians on the right immediately raised the alarm.
We are determined to preserve the British character of Britain. We welcome other races in reasonable numbers, but we have already admitted more than we can absorb.
The British government made a last-ditch attempt to persuade India to take the unwanted Kenyan Asians. A delegation was sent to Delhi.
This was in order to explore through the High Commission there with the Indian government whether they would be receptive to the idea of some of these Indian people going back to India. Going back is the wrong way of describing it, because most of them had never been in India, but they were Indian in origin, and they had as strong a connection with India as they did with the United Kingdom. But the Indian government, I think, with hindsight, quite understandably, felt that these were people who'd cast their lot in with Africa, and thereby with the United Kingdom, and that was where they should go.
This is a scene that's occurring almost every night at Nairobi Airport. Nearly 1,000 people a week, perhaps more than 1,000 a week, are now leaving Kenya for Britain. This is the Asian community, a community of which still about 125,000 people are entitled, as British citizens, to come to Britain.
But that entitlement was soon to be downgraded. Those Asians who hadn't set off for Britain were about to have their right to automatic entry dramatically and abruptly removed. In the last week of February 1968, Callaghan rushed through legislation that would keep the Asians out.
I remember getting home at 7:15 when my husband was asleep in bed. I flopped on the bed and said, "Ted, get me a cup of tea." And while he did, I dozed off for 3 minutes. Then I had to get up, have a bath, some breakfast and go to a cabinet meeting. Well, the awful thing was, I remember that in that cabinet meeting I struggled to keep awake. But it was Jim Callaghan droning on as Home Secretary. He just could not stay awake. That haunted me ever for the rest of my cabinet life, the fact that I'd never fallen asleep in cabinet before. And to do it on that bill, I could see my enemies attacking me. She never said a word.
This march on Downing Street was one of the first repercussions against the government's plan to curb the entry of Asians from Kenya into Britain. They weren't all Asians who felt strongly opposed to the new policy, which is designed to control the flood of immigrants into a more easily absorbed, steady flow.
I thought it was a moral disgrace. Never mind race, it broke a pledge that we had given. I'm not in favour of governments breaking solemn pledges.
Wilson and Callaghan and the others panicked, and therefore they brought in this shameful piece of legislation, which was clearly racist in the sense that they weren't worried about an influx of white farmers from the Kenyan highlands. They were purely worried about Asians.
And other, more senior Conservatives were also uneasy.
I remember one night sort of walking up and down the lobbies in the House of Commons, agonising as to whether we were right to be prepared to go along with the Callaghan government, and which was the view of the shadow cabinet as a whole, or whether we ought not to stand out against it. And in the end, rightly or wrongly, we decided to fall in line.
There was outcry on the streets, but Labour ministers were still agonising over the right course of action.
I thought in principle it was the wrong thing to do because it flew in the face of our very serious Commonwealth obligations and indeed our international obligations generally. And therefore, for me as for others, it was a very, very painful business in the House of Commons at that time.
George Thompson was representing the difficulties that would arise. I wasn't unaware of the difficulties that would arise. We all were. We knew very well the difficulties. But there were also problems that we had to face here. And we had to balance those problems.
Shelley Williams and I spent the entire passage meal together, I was going to say moaning to each other, what do we do? And we went to see Jim Gallan twice and we talked about resigning.
Yet in the space of 72 hours, MPs pushed through a law that turned British passport holders from Kenya into second-class citizens.
Thousands of miles away in Nairobi, Kenya's capital, the Asian community prepared to leave. Britain was their destination. But the entry gates were quickly being closed.
British passport holder Babu Mehta's application to join his family and pregnant wife in Britain fell the wrong side of February 1968.
When I applied for the visa, they refused me. Said you can't join the family until you get your turn for the visa. So I had to stay back.
Babu Mehta was thrown into prison as an illegal immigrant after he tried to come to Britain anyway, but without the necessary papers.
So we were put all together with other criminals. There were 2 in rooms. We had to do toilet and everything in a room.
Eventually, the British authorities sent him back to Nairobi.
I went to Nairobi shortly after the legislation, and I saw the queues outside the British High Commission, which of course was a terrible sight for British citizens having to queue in all weathers in the street to try and get vouchers.
Babu Mehta was one of a group of Kenyan Asians who camped outside the British High Commission as a protest against Britain's refusal to honour their passports.
They all had a touching faith that we would honour the British passport that they got. And they found they were not being treated as they saw it fairly. And so they came and in many cases were camped outside my immigration office. And it was a very demeaning situation.
The reasons for refusing your application, which we are not prepared to discuss, reiterated that an entry certificate cannot be issued, and therefore I refuse your application. The matter is out of our hands.
Increasingly concerned about his wife's health, Babu Mehta wrote to the wife of one of the British officials, pleading with her to intervene with her husband. The High Commission deemed the letter offensive. Mehta decided to fly to London, even though he still didn't have the right entry certificate.
We went to Uganda, and from Uganda they sent us back again to Nairobi. And this time, the Kenyan government didn't accept us. They sent us back to Entebbe. Entebbe, they sent us back to Addis Ababa. And from Addis Ababa, we went back to England. And from England, they sent us back to Kenya. Again, from Kenya, they didn't expect us, so they sent us back to London. Again, they sent us from London to Nairobi. And the last time, they sent us back from Nairobi to London. And this time, they accepted us.
Like Babu Mehta, British Asians from Kenya who wanted to come to Britain were often forced to wait, sometimes for years, just as the Act had intended.
I can only say that for me it was a trauma for the 36 hours. I should have resigned over the bill. I voted for a lot of things that the House of Commons I shouldn't have voted for. But that's what political life is like. There's only one I should have been so opposed to that I resigned, and it was that.
Some campaigners claimed that Babu Mehta would have been able to join his wife more easily if the Home Secretary had been Roy Jenkins.
I can't say for certain whether I would have introduced the bill. I'd have been very loath to do so. I was trying to grapple with what seemed to most people at the time to be the central thing threatening the life of the government, which was the balance payments economic situation, the position of sterling. And I think I would have thought it was a little light-hearted to run away from that on a resignation of principle on the Kenyan Nations bill, which indeed I had allowed to be prepared by officials. I think I said, go slow, try and avoid doing it, I don't like it, etc., but I didn't say more than that.